question is, now it sounds like Ukraine's going to be giving up about 20% of their land with this deal. What are they giving up as far as natural resources, percentage of their population, or their infrastructure? How does it really affect them other than the land?
What has he got for background?
So the advantage for Ukraine, I mentioned earlier that Russia had asked, in addition to Crimea, they had won all four of the regions where they have some presence, and that would have resulted in an immense loss of resources and population from Ukraine. Given where it appears the lines are headed, there's no way to know for sure until it's done, it'll be a much more minimal loss. So the primary difficulty for Ukraine will be geographic. There will be some economic and population impact, but not nearly to the same degree as I would have predicted even a few weeks ago.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dan and Roger. And then I see Rick put your question. He has a question in the chat. Rick, you want to come on?
Yes. So Dan, I hate to switch to a different topic. This has all been very interesting, but I always like to get your view on how you feel about the survival of our democracy in the face of all of Trump's various attacks on it, particularly in response to some of the legal rulings against him, although many of those rulings are going against him, and he's complied with some, but he's dancing around others and flaunting others. So what's your view a month farther on than since I asked this question a month ago?
I am actually slightly more encouraged now than I was a month ago. I'll emphasize slightly, Rick, before you write me off as just naive, but I will say this: the number of cases that the administration are facing, to me, is an excellent sign that the separation of powers and the balance between the three branches is effective. Now, what I've also noticed, and you may have as well, is that while the Trump administration is slow walking on some of them, pretending to misunderstand on the others, here's what we haven't seen. You've not seen a president say simply, no, I won't, to the courts. And I believe that as these cases make their way through the pipeline up to the Supreme Court, not all of them, but many of them, that Trump will grumble, he'll agitate. But until I see him completely flout and ignore and publicly repudiate a decision, I see the system not working perfectly, but I see it working largely the way the founders had anticipated. If you've noticed, just in the last week, not in the last month, in the last week, we've seen much more sweeping rulings, again, that will be appealed upward, saying local governments cannot be deprived of funding because they disagree with the Trump administration on immigration policy. We've seen much more sweeping decisions on the administration refusing to fund acts of Congress. And so I do see this heading in the right direction. Well, I try to stay balanced, but I betrayed a little bit. But whether I'm a Republican or Democrat, I do want to see all three branches of government work together. So I do see the courts, I do see the judicial branch asserting themselves in the way that the system has intended. I also believe, if you look at public opinion polls, that the likelihood of Democrats reclaiming at least one chamber of Congress next November creates another counterweight to Trump. And for the first time in the last week or two, as Governor Sununu in New Hampshire has chosen not to run, as Governor Kemp in Georgia has decided not to run for the Senate seats in their states, it's the first time I've seen even the slightest of possibilities for Democrats retaking the majority in the Senate. Last time you and I talked, I would have said that while the House looks likely, the Senate looks impossible. I still think Republicans have an advantage in terms of a Senate majority. but the possibility of Democrats getting to 51 seats now to me is plausible for the first time since November. So again, major caveat there. If the president or his administration were to take that next step and simply refuse to adhere to a court decision, then that's one thing. But I feel like that's a step that has not yet occurred. And the fact that the courts are getting more assertive with broader pronouncements makes me feel, like I said earlier, slightly more positive.
Well, not that you need my approval, but that's pretty much the way I see it too. Still a very dangerous situation, but that I think he's being somewhat restrained by court actions so far. So thank you.
Well, actually, that makes me feel better, Rick. So thank you for the.
Well, not that you need my approval, but thank you.
No, I'd say particularly for the regulars here, I've gained a lot of respect for how thoughtful many of you are. So I feel better when you're not telling me how stupid I am. Jim, that's your cue.
Yeah, I hate to be a drag, but I appreciate both of you, Rick and Dan, but I'm also thinking about the fact that judges are actually facing threats to their lives, and that this president is encouraging it. J.D. Vance as well, and even members of Congress, that judges who are doing their job at the federal level, should be impeached for their decisions. And also, this administration is now weaponizing, as I think we know, the justice system. They have opened a criminal investigation into the Attorney General of New York, who I believe had some successful prosecutions, if you will, and investigations of Trump. So I think it is weighted there. Speaking as one who spent a lot of time in this arena, our justice system, our rule of law is under serious attack. I'm not going to say it's at the breaking point, but it is being stressed beyond anything that I've seen in my lifetime.
Well, Jim, I hate to disappoint you, but I agree with everything you said. But I would add to it that watching the courts becoming more assertive in recent weeks is what makes me slightly more encouraged. I'm not happy. I'm worried. But Rick's question was a comparative one, not an absolute one. So slightly more encouraged as I watch the judicial system, I would argue much faster than the legislative branch, beginning to find its footing in this administration.
By the way, you never disappoint me, but I'm still, I think nothing can shock me, but when the President of the United States says, I don't know that I'm supposed to uphold the Constitution, that's why I have lawyers.
Well, I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I think that's ignorance more than malice. But I would say this, when I was talking about disappointing you, I was talking about you being disappointed that I agreed with you.
No, you and I, for those who don't know, I was very active on the Democratic side at the time, not as successful as Dan. I wasn't, a professional as he was. So we definitely were at points diametrically opposed. I did have respect for George Deukmejian, who you, I believe, helped elect, and I met him when he was Attorney General. I was working for Marilyn Ryan. But I think we've come to a place of understanding and agreement. Am I spoiling things by saying most days?
Not in the slightest. I'll point out, I think as the group knows, that I've been an independent for many years. I like to say I'm an independent because neither party would have me. But I'm not quite old enough to have worked for George Deukmejian, but otherwise, Jim, you're right on track. How about Jim Clark? What do you think, Maddie? Should we let the other Jim talk?
I think so.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you. Most
Anytime,
people
Jim.
won't. Certainly, my wife won't, and I really don't blame her. She's probably wise. A quick comment and then a question. The comment is I involved the Georgetown Institute of Public Policy, and Mo Eifley was in town on Monday, who you may know, who runs the institute, which is part of the McCourt School, and we were talking about this issue. And I think, Dan, the only quarrel I've got with what you said before about the system operating as the founders intended, I really think they thought the Article 1 body, the Congress, would be the primary check on the executive, not the Article 3 courts. And my question to Mo, and one I would I think is worth it's consistent with what Jim and Rick are saying, is the stress being put on the courts. And I say this as a longtime lawyer and practiced in front of a lot of courts, including the Supreme Court, is not something I think we've seen before. And Congress has been a better check in the past. And this Congress is supine, where Trump's concerned, it seems to me. And I regard that as extremely, extremely dangerous. So that's just my 2 cents as a very long time lawyer. My question, though, is somewhat different. I had a very brief chance yesterday at the World Affairs Council's event with Jim Stavridis, who was really terrific, by the way, I thought. I know several people on this call were there. And I briefly asked him about what Hegseth is doing. And the most recent thing he did was he's going to cut 20% of all the 4-stars, admirals and generals, without regard really to their merits or to the commands that they have. And I just like your reaction to what, if at some point the Republicans in Congress looking at the defense situation in this, in my view, grossly incompetent Secretary of Defense, if they're ever going to do anything.
So I would be extremely surprised if Pete Hegseth is the Secretary of Defense a year from today. I watched the comfort which with Trump demoted Mike Walls, and I think Hegseth is heading in the same direction. Ultimately, if you cost Trump more politically than you help him, you ultimately pay the professional price for it. I agree with you that the decision to incur such dramatic reductions without first having a very considered and detailed process to determine what's the right thing to do. I'm not arguing against the reductions. They may be right, they may be wrong. But the fact that they seem to be done on impulse and on whim, as opposed to the result of considered research, is what troubles me, and it troubles me greatly. Politico ran an article, not specifically about this, but more broadly about the Doge cuts a month or so ago. And they interviewed former Republican governors who had run for governor of their states to reduce the size of state government. And they, people like Chris Christie in New Jersey, people like Mitch Daniels in Indiana, and others, talked about how much work they needed to do, how much research they needed to do before they could determine the most effective way of paring back government. And these governors, some of us might agree with their decisions, some might disagree, were nervous about this administration's approach, not because they thought government didn't need to be reduced, they agreed that it did, but that it was being done without that kind of preparation and forethought. And I think Hegseth is an excellent example of that. To your first point, I know it wasn't a question, I agree with you. I think the founders wanted all 3 branches to work in concert, and they looked, of course, definitionally at the legislative branch as the first. And I think one of the reasons they had 3 is in case it was necessary. If you had just a legislative branch and just an executive branch, or just an executive branch and just a judicial branch, the failure or shortcoming of one could lead to real catastrophe. Having 3 offered another level of protection. So even though there's more strain and stress being put on the courts than they deserve, I feel like the role they are playing now is evidence that a 3-pronged approach that the founders envisioned was a wise one. And if at a certain point the courts begin to buckle under that strain, perhaps at that point the legislative branch will be in a better position to step up. But although I don't think I ever heard James Madison refer to it as such, a belt and suspenders approach to democracy seems to have been a good call.
Right. Got any other questions? I don't see any
I
hands.
see that
up.
Diane does.
Go for it, Diane. You jump on in. Oh, Diane, you are muted.
Okay.
All good.
When Hegseth comes out with a statement like that about the 20% of the officers, is that from a Doge recommendation? Is it what Trump wants, or is it just Hegseth's idea?
Well, Diane, I think it's actually a combination of those three. Based on Trump's support for Musk and for Doge, I think it's what Hegseth thinks Trump would want.
Okay.
So it's not him acting completely unilaterally. He thinks he's doing Trump's bidding. And who knows, he might be, we don't know. But I don't think he knows either. I think this is his way of shoring up his position with the president.
And when you said you don't think he'll be in this position a year from now, how many more blatant idiotic things does he need to do to get the heave-ho?
I don't think I can quantify it precisely, but I'd say several.
Okay.
But again, we watched this with Trump before, both in his first term at some length. When you stop being of political benefit to him,
Yeah.
he stops wanting you. And I think Hegseth already has benefited from Walt's mishandling his role in Signalgate so badly.
Yeah.
If Waltz had done a more effective interview on Fox News, he'd still be in his job. Either one of them could have been culpable for it. Waltz just left himself more vulnerable. Hegseth will get his turn in the barrel. I'm pretty confident of that.
Good. Okay.
Thank you, Diane. And then Sid and Sandy, I see a question, hand up over there. Oh, you're on mute.
Okay, is that better?
There
All
we go.
set.
All right. In view of Diane's question, I want to take it a bit further. We have an age now where there's a lot of fake news circulating on social media, on conventional media, and being encouraged by many in the Trump administration. My question is, what is it like to be a political science professor under these circumstances?
Good question.
Okay. It's challenging, but it's fun. And I'll admit, I get a my advantage is I get a self-selected group. Definitionally, I get a group of young people every semester who are truly curious to learn more about this stuff. And obviously they come in with their own opinions and their own ideologies. But what I tell them on the first day of the semester is I said, if you have a political ideology, and I hope you do, leave it at the door. And I'll do the same. Because we're not going to gain anything by screaming and yelling at each other all semester. I said, if I teach you anything this spring or this fall, I want to teach you how to be an analyst and not an advocate. And don't get me wrong, I want you to be an advocate. I want you to be an advocate in Sproul Plaza at Berkeley or on Truesdale at USC. I want you to go to rallies. I want you to go to protests. I want you to be an advocate for the causes and the issues and the candidates you believe in. But in here, we're going to be analysts. Because one, it's going to be a more productive conversation. Second, you're going to learn more from conversing with someone rather than screaming at them. And third, when you go back outside these walls, you're going to be a better advocate now that you have a better understanding of not only what the other side believes, but why they believe it. And so not every one of my students buys into that, but most of them do. And even in office hours, when they tell me what they really think, they've got very strong opinions. The fact that they've learned or are willing to learn how to put those ideological preferences aside, just even for a couple of hours, in order to engage in productive conversation, that's what makes it fun for me. And so the fake news element of it does make it more challenging. You'll get a kick out of this. On their final papers, they have to write a campaign strategy for a real life candidate running for statewide or national office. And I give them an outline of all the different things that are required on that paper. It's a 20 to 25 page paper that is a 3-page outline that they have to follow. And in boldface in the second last section of the outline, it says, your candidate's biggest weakness in your plan for addressing it. And that line is the only thing in boldface on the entire outline. And what I tell them is, I said, if you want to get an A on your paper, you have to identify your candidate's greatest weakness. Explain to me why it is. Admit that you can't get rid of it, but explain how you're going to engage in the conversation with voters who disagree with you on it. And so, again, those who are willing to stick with it, I'm not trying to change their mind from left to right or right to left, but just remind them that in a democracy, as opposed to a monarchy, not everybody gets nobody gets everything they want. And I teach, and I'm sorry to be going on so long with this, and I really want to get to Janice's question. We're going to stay late if we have to make sure she gets a chance to talk. But Sid, I tell the students that I subscribe to what I call 40-yard line politics. And I said, too much politics today takes place in the end zones. Republican Party way over in this end zone, Democratic Party way over in that end zone. I said, I'm not going to try to get you all the way to midfield. I'm just going to get you to that space between the 40s, where at least you can have a reasonable conversation with somebody on the other side of midfield. Because from 100 yards away in a full stadium, all you can do is scream and yell. And so getting to that space between the 40s is really what the class is, what I try to make the class all about. So challenging but fun. And thank you for letting me ramble on, because you can tell it's something I really enjoy, both the rambling and the teaching. Janice, how about you? What was your question?
Well, going back to the comments and questions from Rick and the two Jims and your comments, I'm curious about a prediction, which I know is really hard to do, but especially after I heard Trump state that he wasn't really sure about the Constitution and about the rights of individuals and so forth. Do any of you gentlemen predict that he will actually, in fact, say no to the Supreme Court or the federal judges? Do you think he's actually at some point going to refuse? It seems to me he's sort of inching up to that, but I'm curious if other people predict that he will, in fact, say no, and there'll be a huge problem.
I'll let Rick and the Jims answer first, and then I'll weigh in.
Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, okay. I certainly think that he's capable of it. I certainly think that there's a likelihood that he will. Whether I think he does or not, I think may depend on how much support he thinks he has in the country generally, and specifically to the extent the polling can tease this out, how much support he thinks he has in terms of challenging the courts. With his polling numbers going down, like Dan said, we're starting to see, although it's very early, a little bit of stiffening among some of the Republicans in Congress. He withdrew his nominee for the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia because he was so controversial. So I think I think that will depend on whether he does it. And I just had one other quick comment about the generals, and it relates to this topic. My wife and I feel that one of the reasons they may be doing this is to clear out leadership in the Pentagon that would be less likely to obey an illegal order,
Yes.
to make it more likely that Trump and Hegseth could, in essence, seize control of the military and use them not for a partial coup attempt like January 6th was, but for an actual coup attempt. So that's my comment.
Okay.
Jim, do you want to go next or do you want me to respond first?
Go ahead, Jim. I'll follow you.
Okay.
These gyms are incredibly polite.
I am my mother's son. So, unfortunately, I do agree with Rick on that, but also I'm thinking that this Congress, which I think one of our colleagues here described as supine, is not going to challenge him. A normal Congress, when you defy the Supreme Court, that certainly meets, in my mind, and I'm a law school dropout, but I'm a public administrator, the definition of impeachable, high crimes and misdemeanors, and certainly goes against everything I know that makes us a constitutional government. But he's in an echo chamber. He has Stephen Miller whispering in his ear and other sycophants. So yes, I think that his wanton disregard for constitutional norms and for democracy, I think he would, in fact, defy the court. And unlike the Nixon era, this Congress will do nothing.
I have a somewhat, this is the other Jim, somewhat different take. By the way, I'm glad Ed Martin is gone for a lot of reasons, but Janine Pirro is the replacement. So another, seriously, she's going to be a new U.S. Attorney for D.C. If you're a Fox News host, apparently that's the primary qualification for membership in the upper echelons of the Trump administration. I think that he will not defy the courts, primarily because something Rick suggested. I read the polling on this, and the polling on his defiance of the courts runs about 70% against him. And I think he's in too precarious a position, and the closely contested congressional districts are such, especially in the districts in the House, I think he won't do it for political reasons.
Right.
And I agree with Jim C. So from now on, Jim Grant will be other Jim. But
Not sure if that's a demotion or promotion, but thank you, as long as I'm being part of the conversation.
But Janice, I think it's such a smart question, because I think so much hinges on the answer. My own feeling is that when he answered, or when he didn't answer the question more accurately, about defending the Constitution, about due process, I don't think that was a strategic answer. I think, and you know how hard I try not to take sides in these things, even though I lapse every once in a while, as you've seen. I don't think he knew the answer to either of those questions. I think he generally did not know the answers. Now, that's disturbing for all sorts of reasons, but it's disturbing for different reasons than the reasons I think many people have assumed. So, and if you notice this, when he doesn't know the answer to a question, he defers to someone on his staff. When he thinks he knows the answer, he'll give it. And so I think just sort of the reflex there is we'll leave it to the lawyers. The only time I've seen him defer, not out of ignorance, and this goes to Jim C's other point, is when he was asked a couple weeks ago about returning Abrego Garcia to the U.S. And he said, well, that's up to the lawyers. That wasn't ignorance, that's him dodging responsibility. But for the most part, when he defers, it's because he honestly doesn't know the answer. And, the memoirs of many of his first term advisors are chock full of, and I don't say this from a partisan perspective, but just chock full of absolutely extraordinary things that he simply did not know. And so when I heard, I don't know if it's my job to defend the Constitution or not, I can promise you he'd never given it a moment's thought, so he wouldn't have known how to answer the question.
Mm.
But I do think Jim's point about the polls are right. I think the decision to back off on Martin today is an indicator, just like his decision to back off on the most onerous of the tariffs is an indicator. He does live in a bubble. He is spoon-fed polls that reinforce his beliefs. But he also, at some level, senses when he's going too far, not for the kind of reasons we're talking about, but to maintain an appropriate level of public support. And if he thinks that those working class voters are going to turn on him because he doesn't respect the rule of a judge's order, he'll back off the same ways he'll back off on tariffs or on Ed Martin when he thinks that there's a pushback coming. But there's probably a full webinar just in that one question. but for the time being, and we've talked about this before, and I will quote someone else so I don't have to take sides. But as someone, I think, a friend of mine of whom I think very highly, says, boy, think of how lucky we'd be, how much worse it would be if you were smart.
Yes.
Okay. But I attribute that to someone else because I, of course, don't take sides.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, as always, I think you've probably got my gratitude by heart now because you hear it every month. But this is my favorite part of the program, and I can't tell you how much I enjoy talking with all of you for this last half an hour plus. I think you all can notice we've never, ever ended it on time, which, if nothing else, proves that even though I usually listen to Maddie, I don't when it's really important to me. So have a great month, and I will see you guys all in early June.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
My name is Israel Galin, and this is my first time in this forum, and I must admit I like it. But I want to, regarding the last question that we dealt with about what will Trump do, I was, as a 78 years old person myself, I was surprised that you have not mentioned his age relative to this question. I would invite us to ponder whether a younger Trump, how he will act in regarding this possibility to a 78-year-old Trump. I suspect that I detect some tiredness in him in recent times that may work in our favor about what he will actually do in the face of a moment when he has to obey or reject the recommendation of a court. That's I leave to you if you have wanna ponder about this question.
So it's going to sound like I'm changing the subject on you, but I promise you I'm not.
Well,
during the 1964 presidential campaign, the American Psychiatrists Association passed a rule for its members prohibiting them from diagnosing someone who they had not met in person. That was primarily to keep them from diagnosing Barry Goldwater's psychological grounding. And so, with a few exceptions, the profession pretty much adheres to that when it comes to Trump. That said, there have been studies done of his speech patterns over the last couple of years compared to earlier in his life. And what those analyses have shown is a much greater likelihood of him losing his train of thought, of repeating himself, and other sorts of telltale signs of the type of thing that you're talking about. So no question no question, but it appears there's at least some evidence that your instinct is correct. And so if I take that premise at face value, what I'm then left with is that even a man of his age who's not as sharp as he was 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, he still has some instinct for political boundaries that aren't always right, we all know. But somewhere in him, and the tariffs announcement, the Jim Martin announcement, suggests that even if he's not as acute as he may have been at a younger age, that he's still at a point where he can recognize these points of demarcation. And in the interest of partisan fairness, I suspect we could say the same thing about Joe Biden.
But for the record, for the
I
record, I want to, in my opinion, he is less likely to reject a decision of the court as a 78 years old than a 68 years old. That was my opinion in regarding tiredness and energy and his transactional nature, that he's perceiving that he will not enjoy for long, even if he will succeed.
Right. Oh, I misunderstood your point.
Yes,
Thank you so much for clarifying.
Yes.
I'm gonna need some time to consider that one, okay?
Yeah.
Because it's fascinating. It really is. But as I think the regulars know, if I don't feel confident answering a question, I will very politely and verbosely say, I'm not smart enough to answer that question.
No, I did not try to be a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I think I am in his age, and I feel tired at times more frequent than before.
Well, I am several years younger than him. I feel more tired than I did before.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, everybody. I will look forward to seeing you in June.